He was a mathematician and a philosopher in the UK. And he said mankind is a curious accident in a backwater. And then Peter Atkins, mankind is just a bit of slime on the planet. And then we have Stephen Jay Gould, and he said mankind is just a fortuitous afterthought on the bush of life, like just something that happened by chance. Those three men are all dead, by the way, and they now know differently, don't they? Richard Dawkins, who is still alive, he said, we live in a universe which has no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So according to these men, we are just a bag of chemicals. That's all we are. There is no foundation for morality. Now, we've had about 170 years of the teaching of evolution in our culture, and as a result of it, there is a general attitude against morality. Now, that's not the only cause, because if you go back to Genesis 6 at verse 5, the thoughts and the intents of the hearts were only evil all the time. But we know that evolutionary thinking undermines morality. In contrast, if we start with biblical creation, Ian, you were emphasizing how important this is, right? I want you to think for a moment, why did I put biblical creation below God's word? Think for a minute, and I'll come back to that. When we start with the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we really have the beginning of the Bible. In sense that it is, the whole gospel is there in seed form. We have creation, obviously, in Genesis 1. We're given morality in that God says you shall not eat from a particular tree. And we know as a result of Adam and Eve's sin, when they introduced decay and death into the universe. We have male-female marriage introduced in those early chapters. And we have mankind given a purpose in Genesis 1:26, where we read that you shall have dominion over the creation. So a lot of important information is already there in it's a summary form of what the Bible unfolds later. We also find the gospel, because in Genesis 3:15, after Adam and Eve had sinned and God had invoked the curses on them, there's the promise that a Redeemer is coming. So we have in there. Now, why? And this is a question I'd like you to answer, someone. Why did I put biblical creation below God's word? Sorry? Okay. So now I'm going to pull one on you. What biblical evidence do you have for that? But I'm not going to ask you to answer that, but it's good. So it's interesting. You sang that children's song going through the 7 days of the creation week. How does Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 open? You should all be able to say it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, if you skip over to verse 3, what do we see there? And God said, let there be light. Do you see the order there? God first presents himself and his character as a creator, and then the next thing he presents is as a communicator. And that's why I have them in that order, because God's foundational doctrine is creation. That's Genesis 1:1. Go to the book of Revelation. What do we find there? You are worthy, O God, to receive glory and honor. Why? Because you created all things. If you go into Nehemiah, in the middle of the Persian exile, in his prayer, he declares God is the creator. You go to Isaiah in chapter 44 and chapter 45, when God challenges the idols, he declares himself as the creator. You go to the Psalms, like Psalm 104 and Psalm 19, God declares himself as the creator. In the oldest complete book in the Bible, which is the book of Job, it was probably composed about 200 years before Abram came on the scene. What do you find there when the Job's counselors, and we'll put that in quotes, are challenging him. God steps in and he says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Do you see? From cover to cover, God defends himself as the creator. That's his basis. In fact, I have another presentation where I show that you can basically get every single doctrine based on creation, morality, on salvation, on declaration of sin, and everything, because he is the creator. So you were right. It is the foundational doctrine. Whoever said that. Yeah. Now, many Christians will say, "Oh, I believe that God created," and they will also have a Christian worldview that they're against some of the ethical challenges that we see in our culture right now and being pushed by some of our governments. But what we find is that there are two basic challenges. One is that people have been so conditioned to believe that the earth is billions of years old and the universe many, many more billions of years old, and the idea that God could have used evolution. I was presenting at a Christian school north of here, almost directly north of here, and I presented the dino talk to the younger kids. And I put up a slide which has a T-Rex, a dolphin, a fish, and a bird on it. And I asked which of these is the oldest. Now, these are all kids in a Christian school. And I ask, overwhelmingly, they say the T-Rex. Go back to the Genesis account. When were the land animals, sorry, let me ask it the other way. When were the sea creatures and the air creatures created? What day? You were singing it. Did you internalize it? What day were they created? Yes, sir. You're right. And what day were land animals created? Day 6. So you guys, if you're going to sing these, you should be internalizing the message, shouldn't you? So, day 6. So the T-Rex is actually a day younger than the air and sea life. But you see how conditioned we've been by the pushing of evolution, that even children that are growing up in Christian homes and going to a Christian school immediately think that dinos are ancient, right? So what happens when the church follows the world is we see the fallout, particularly in young people, because when they hit university, they are confronted by teachings which they cannot challenge. I was speaking north of Toronto in Alliston, that's where Honda has their manufacturing facilities, and there were two young women there who were in third year chemistry at Trent University, and it was on their March break. And asked them afterwards how they were finding it, and they said first year every single course was pushing evolution. By the time they got into third year, it was all real technical science, and evolution had fallen behind. So I encouraged them to stay with it. We need Christians in the sciences. And these are the kinds of questions, though, that you might be confronted with either in your own thinking or in those who come and ask you about your beliefs. And so I'm not going to read these, but you need to think about how best to address these. So there are professing Christians who, and I believe they're saved, who are stressed by certain things. For example, they want to know how the Ice Age fits in. I even have talked to Christians who say, I don't really believe there were dinosaurs, things like that. So we need to address some of this. When I began getting interested in this subject, I was in high school, and I do have to mention this. I attended Sir John A. Macdonald Collegiate. And our stupid Toronto School Board is wasting money trying to change the name of that school. And they're, I don't know, millions of dollars over budget in debt. So it's just so stupid. Anyway, so I went to hear a speaker. We had Interschool Christian Fellowship, and a friend invited me to attend at his church where there was a speaker just like this. And it was a man named Whitcomb who, with a man named Morris, wrote a book called The Genesis Flood. And since then, I have just consumed science and theology and so on, because it is a passion of mine. By the way, I'm just part-time with CMI. I'm a volunteer speaker. I only commit to doing 4 Sundays in the spring and 4 in the fall. But when I go out, they pack everything into it. So I do 8 talks in 4 days. I have one more this evening, so they push me. But so I'm here to tell you that since I started getting interested in this, the amount of information that has become available to us, particularly in the last 20 years, it simply is astounding, that defends biblical creation. It really does. And so, as Richard Fangard, our CEO, and he's been the Canadian CEO of CMI for 25 years, he says it's a great time to be a Christian. CMI has organization. We're an international organization. We were founded in Australia about 50 years ago. We have offices in New Zealand, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, and Europe, United States, and Canada. And we have speakers in all those locations. And in Canada, we have 7 speakers. We just added a brand new speaker in Edmonton. He is phenomenally brilliant. This fellow was homeschooled. He applied to the University of Alberta, and they rejected homeschoolers at the time. Family knew somebody in the dean's office, so they made an exception. He ended up going through the chemistry program, went out and worked in the oil industry for a few years, and felt that all he was a lab technician. He went back to the University of Alberta and applied to go to do a doctorate. And they said, oh, it's you. You don't have to do a master's. You can go directly into the PhD program. 2 years ago, he came out of the PhD program, and he blew away the faculty with his approach. The University of Alberta actually owns the patents on what he's developed, and apparently he's going to revolutionize oil extraction, what he's come up with. And he's just come online as one of our speakers. So they're thankful for his enthusiasm. I need to defend evolution. Sorry, not defend it. Define it. Strike the record. I need to define evolution because that term gets thrown around a lot. If you get nothing else out of this presentation, get this definition down because it will help you to challenge worldly thinking. So the idea is that all of life started from a single cell. Let's not worry so much about pre-biological chemical evolution today. I deal with that in another presentation called Chance and the Origin of Life. But let's deal with an entity that can respirate. That means it can breathe, it can reproduce, it can metabolize. That means it can eat food and so on, right? It can't be a virus. Why not? Why can life not have originated from a virus? Exactly. So you're into the old chicken and egg problem. How did you get a virus if you don't have a host, right? So it can't be a virus. So let's assume that it's some form of a bacterium. Let's assume that. The simplest life form that seems to meet the qualifications that I've outlined there briefly has roughly 480 genes in it that can produce the different proteins that are needed. Over time, genetic variety, according to evolutionists, genetic information has been increasing, and by the time you reach all of the species at the top of the tree, plants and animals and birds and everything else, single-celled entities, you have a vast array of genetic information, and the human genome, we've gone from 480 genes to 25,000 genes. And all that information has been coming about through random chance. That's what they're saying. Genetic information has been increasing through time. And there are entities that have gone extinct found in the fossil record. Some have gone extinct more recently, like during the Ice Age, or even during the time of human exploration. Like they killed all the great auks of Newfoundland, and they killed all of the dodo birds in Madagascar. Those kinds of things. Almost wiped out the rhinoceros. But they're in the branches are the missing links. No fossils are found there. And evolutionists define that term. In fact, Stephen Jay Gould, who I quoted from earlier, he spent much of his academic career trying to explain how the missing links. And he came up with something called punctuated equilibrium, which I won't detail right now. But here's Lynn Margulis. She's no longer alive. Her definition of evolution: every form of life on Earth, oak tree, elephant, bird, and bacterium, shares a common ancestry with every other form. So you get this down. Something in a single cell, however it got there, all of this genetic information has developed and increased through time. That's evolution, the definition. That's what we're going to challenge. This isn't evolution. When you breed dogs, you actually lose genetic information. A specialized dog is not as robust as a mutt. If you want to have robust dogs, you want to mix breeds. They are more robust. One of my wife's cousins bred for a while Dalmatians, and in every third generation he would breed in Husky or something else to strengthen the bloodline, because the Dalmatians would get weaker and weaker through time. So this is not evolution, it's devolution, as you lose genetic information. Similarly here, a tea plant was found in China. This is a standard black tea, like orange pekoe tea, right? And it's caffeine free. Now, that's pretty cool, because some people would like to have decaffeinated tea before they go to bed. Did you all have a coffee or tea today? Yep. Did any of you drink a decaffeinated ones? You all had caffeine today. Okay. So did I. So why do plants like coffee plants, cocoa plants, tea plants, and others, why do they have caffeine in them? What's the purpose of the caffeine? It's a pesticide. Did you know then, whoever held up the cup there, she's drinking a pesticide right now? Now, we drink it in very low quantities generally, except some of those jolt type drinks. The caffeine is actually bad for your heart because there's so much caffeine in them. But I will not drink a decaffeinated, chemically decaffeinated tea or coffee. Do you see up in the upper right there? One of the chemicals they use for taking the caffeine out is methyl chloride. It's paint and nail polish remover. Yeah, what? It's far it's far worse for you, believe me, than the caffeine is. So I believe that someday, though, that this plant will become a great bestseller. But it takes about 7 years for a tea plant to reach maturity so that you can start harvesting leaves. And they need fields and fields of this so they could go commercial. And if they're going to grow these tea plants, they're going to have to protect them from the caterpillars. So they're probably going to have to use an artificial pesticide anyway, right? But it may be so I don't know how you're going to have organic decaffeinated, naturally decaffeinated tea, right? But nevertheless, notice what The Economist says. The plant has lost the ability to produce an enzyme called caffeine synthase. Big name, and all it means is make caffeine, synthesize or make caffeine. But notice the word they use. It's evolutionary journey. This isn't evolution, it's devolution. The plant has lost the ability to protect itself from predators, and it's lost genetic information. Do you follow that? That this is loss of genetic information, not an increase. And invariably, you will find when they use the term evolution in this way, in speciation, in natural selection, in human directed selection, in breeding, for example, they call it evolution. No, it isn't. It's reducing the amount of genetic information from the original kinds that came out of the ark. And that is what's going on. Now, we declare, based on the Word of God, that God created in 6 natural days that follow one right after the other. And he did this about 6,000 years ago. At that time, invariably, somebody's heads explode. They don't believe that the universe of the world could only be 6,000 years old. Let's move on to that, but we'll keep that in mind for later. So I would like to give you quickly 5 reasons for believing in biblical creation. First, Genesis 1 is history. And I'm going to spend the most time on this because if we don't get this one right, literally we may as well just pack up if we don't get this one right. And then I just want to very briefly talk about death as a result of Adam's sin, and you'll see how it connects. I want to do a quick sweep through some challenges in biology that evolutionists have. They cannot explain things. So I want to sweep through that. A few pieces of evidence that the world is not billions of years old, and then some facts to support the Genesis flood. So we're dealing with Genesis 1 to 11 in an overview. In each of these topics, I have full-length presentations. So, and you'll give me this if I, so if I go too deep. On the left-hand side is the sequence the evolutionists will tell you from cosmological to chemical to biological evolution. If you read a book like Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time and Carl Sagan's introduction in it, they literally say there was nothing, and then there was a quantum ripple, and then there was a big bang, and so on. Put your thinking hats on. There was nothing. Okay, and then it goes on, and you've probably seen the pictures of birds wanting to migrate onto, not birds, I mean fish wanting to migrate onto land, and they're debating whether they want to become amphibians or whatever, right? On the right-hand side is the sequence right out of Genesis 1. In fact, it's right out of your song. You can just read it, right, as you do this. So, notice you cannot line these up. And there's a basic law of logic, and the law of logic is called the law of non-contradiction. If you've got 2 concepts, ideas that contradict one another, at least one of them must be false. Both could be wrong, but at least one of them must be false. Do you see a major, major disconnect in here, which I believe God did absolutely deliberately? Of course, everything he did was deliberate, but to stymie the foolishness of evolution. What is the major disconnect in here? Okay, so what did God create on day 3? Yes, sir. Sorry? I can't quite hear. Leaves? Oh, no, that was on day earlier. No, you what did he create on day 3? That was on day 1. No, he created plant life on day 3. And what did he create on day 4? The lights, the sun, the moon, the stars. That is the major disconnect in here. Like, so unchallengeable in a sense. How do you overcome that disconnect? Because the plants were created before the sun, the day before. Now, people say, well, how did the plants survive? Well, remember, God had already created light, but putting that aside, it's overnight, one night, and then the sun's there, right? So, but that is the major disconnect. Now, throughout the Christian academic world in particular, there are all these attempts to try to rationalize these. A day-age view, overlapping days, a gap theory, a framework hypothesis, and on and on and on. One of the claims is that Genesis 1 is poetry. It's So let's just look at that because it's simplest one to analyze today. So a study was done by a fellow who has his PhD in Hebrew and also has a background in statistics. And what he did was he looked at the Hebrew verbs. In poetry, Hebrew verbs have a different form than verbs that are in narrative like 1st and 2nd Samuel. And he found overwhelmingly that the verb forms are in Genesis 1 are narrative verb forms. It is not to be read as poetry. And it's not even structured as Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry does idea repetition, similes, and that kind of thing, whereas this is narrative. In fact, Genesis 1 is presented as part of a historical chronology. It just goes, God did this, and he did this, and he did this, all the way down to Abram in Genesis 11. And God created in 6 days to set our pattern for the week. You challenge anybody, why do we have a 7-day week? Do you know there have been attempts throughout history to get rid of the 7-day week? In ancient Egypt, they tried it for a while. In the French Revolution, they tried to get rid of the 7-day week. In the Russian Revolution in 1917, they tried to get rid of it. And Mao in China tried to get rid of it for a while. Always, we revert back to a 7-day week, all around the world. Why do we have a 7-day week? So attempts have been made, well, there's 7 objects in the solar system. We actually can see more than 7 with the native eye. But also, we have 10 digits. Why 7 days? If you're interested, I've written a paper on this to challenge the secular view, and it's on our website. You can go and see it. But God created in 6 days to set a pattern for the week. Augustine, a famous theologian, he said God could have created instantly. He could have. But he chose to create in a 6 days and rest on the 7th, like your song. And we also have this form. I'm emphasizing this because it teaches a very good lesson, right? We have a form in Hebrew called the consecutive law. It's the and. When you see in a narrative ands occurring one right after the other, you are to understand them as following immediately after one another. That is the consecutive and it's a particular sequence that is found in Genesis 1. We don't, in our congregation and in CMI, we use the ESV. Modern translations like the NIV and the ESV tone down the ands because you can translate it as but and then and now and those kinds of things. Those are legitimate translations. But in the Hebrew language, the and just blares at you when you see it. And in the ordinal, we also find in the Genesis account. Now, day 1 is cardinal, day 1. And in your song, they're given as cardinal, interestingly enough. But the subsequent ones are ordinals, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. That is ordinal, in order, in other words. That's how we're getting them. In Numbers 7 and Numbers 29, the sacrifices are being made on the first day, the second day, the third day. There isn't a theologian on the face of the earth that would tell you that those aren't natural days, and yet they turn around and try to impose in Genesis 1 and say they're not natural days. They have biblical evidence that you're to read ordinal as natural days. And then God tells us that they're natural days. They have an evening and a morning. Why do we say morning and evening, and the Hebrew reckoning was evening and morning? Why do we say morning and evening? Do you have any idea? Why we would talk about a day from morning to evening, right? Whereas the Bible and the Hebrews would go from evening to morning. Any idea? Because we have been bamboozled by Roman mythology. What did they worship? Sol, the sun. And the sunrise was when they started their day, worshiping the sun. So we have been fooled by that. Why do the Hebrews have an evening and morning? Because the globe that God created was already spinning, and then he said, let there be light. The globe spun out of darkness into light, as it spun out of darkness into light, evening and morning. So the world started in darkness and then went into light. So that's why we have that rendering. But that's how he tells it. God couldn't have said, well, I created it in 24 hours. 24 hours is, why do we have 24 hours in a day? Some say it was from ancient Samaria, some say it came from Babylon, some say it came from Egypt. It's meaningless. It's 24 hours. If you work in a hospital and you're in long shifts, you start wondering what time it is when you're looking at the clocks, right? 24 hours are a real pain. Swiss watch company on their website proposes we should go to a 10-hour day with 100 minutes in an hour and 100 seconds in a minute. Makes a lot of sense over 24. But in Exodus 20, in the Ten Commandments, and there's a very special construct, 4 and 6 days. 4 and 6 days is a very special construct in the Hebrew language. God sets the pattern for our week right in the Ten Commandments. And if it's not true that he created in 6 natural days, then it's a meaningless analogy for our week. And if he didn't create in 6 days, then he's effectively lying in the middle of the Ten Commandments. Not a good place to put a lie. And then Jesus tells us that God created male and female at the beginning, not 13 billion years after the beginning. Now, I had one little fella, he was about 6 years old, and he comes up to me after the talk, and he says, Mr. Hughes, you told a lie. And I said, what? And he says, no, mankind wasn't created at the beginning. Okay. He said he was created on the 6th day. He's right. But the principle was it was at the beginning, right? And the rest of the Bible treats Genesis 1 as history. Just take one statement in the writing in Hebrews, which I believe Paul was the author of that, but we don't need to debate that. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. I'm not pushing proof text, but if you wanted a proof text against evolution, there it is. He didn't use existing things and evolve them. Each kind was created uniquely. And that's in Hebrews 11:3. So, it seems to me that God could not make any clearer what he did than what he presents in Genesis chapter 1. And I know there are Christians who don't accept that in the plain sense, but I don't know how God could make it any clearer than he has. And I will be blunt. If we do not accept Genesis 1 as a historical statement, exactly as God said, this is what I did, then why accept the virgin conception? Why accept the resurrection miracles? Because God is almighty, and he can create this instantaneously, but he chose to do it over a 6-day period. And again, I'll say, if we don't accept Genesis 1 as a clear statement of history, then we may as well fold our Bibles, because it is the foundational doctrine. Now, I said I would spend the most amount of time on that topic. The rest of them will get briefer. So we'll plow on. On death introduced by Adam's sin. What's that got to do with evolution? Well, it's highly critical, because at the end of the creation week, God saw all that he had made, and he declared it to be very good. Well, if there's been 540 million worth of fossilized remains from the Precambrian to the Cambrian all the way up, we find in the fossil record death and decay and carnivorism and cancer and all kinds of disastrous things. I don't care how you define the word good. That is not good. And we know that it was Adam's sin that introduced death and decay into the universe and into human lives and animals' lives. So every fossil must have been formed after Adam sinned, because there was no death before Adam sinned. So it all had to be. And don't get hung up on this, well, what about plants? Did they die? That is a different life form. The type of life we're talking about is where the Hebrew construct, it's in the Hebrew, it's nefesh chaya, but it means living creatures. And plants are not living creatures. Animals are, as are humans. Now, there's debate among Christian scientists whether insects. In your song, there was a tick or something, right? So there's debate about whether they are animals or not, right? Insects, but we don't need to get into that. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul sets up a contrast where he says we need a historical Adam that introduced sin and death, and then by analogy, we need a historical Christ who conquered sin and death. And that's that analogy. It falls apart if Adam did not introduce death and decay. I'm not going to explore this anymore. We have a TV program called Creation Magazine Live, which we've been producing out of our studios in Kitchener for a decade, and we put out these episodes. They're 30 minutes in length, and one of these episodes here, and you can get it on all kinds of our media channels. So I'd recommend this if you want to explore this deeper. Third topic, I just want to do a sweep through some of the challenges in biology that confront evolutionists. Now, I'm not going to deal today with pre-biological chemical evolution, the molecules that are needed, like the amino acids and various things that are needed to form living entities. But a lot of work has been done trying to synthesize life from raw chemicals, and it has constantly failed. And huge amount of money and intelligence has been attempted. Here's one example. Scientists are still waiting for proof that chemical ingredients can spontaneously assemble themselves, become wrapped in a membrane, and divide. In other words, there's still a missing link between the chemistry of early life and the subsequent biology. Notice they use the word missing link. They have missing links. Here's one other example. One of science's most enduring mysteries, namely how life sprung from non-living matter. So let's assume that we have some of the key essential elements of life. In this case, I'm going to talk about something called nucleotides. And there are basically four of them. And a nucleotide is made up of a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogen group. So they then are used to assemble the DNA in our cells. Do you realize that in the human DNA, every single cell component is made up of a nucleotide, a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogen? So every one of you is made up of sugar. Yeah, exactly. So let's assume that we have that hardware there, the nucleotides. That isn't, it's impossible, by the way, that they can spontaneously come into existence. Let's assume that they're there. That isn't the hard part. The hard part is the information that's coded in DNA. Do you know how many of those nucleotides you have to string together to get the human genome? 3 billion. 3 billion of them, and they have to spell out meaningful words and sentences. I worked in the IT industry, and I've done a lot of project management and coding, and I write software, and I know how hard it is to write meaningful software and to get rid of the bugs in it. But this coding that is in DNA is an astounding program, which we'll look at in a moment. But Paul Davies says, he's a physicist, how did nature fabricate the world's first digital information processor, the original living cell, from the blind chaos of blundering molecules? How did molecular hardware get to write its own software? So I'll make you a wager. I will pay you $1 million. I'll have to sell my house in Scarborough, but I'll pay you $1 million if you can bring to me your cell phone and say, look, it just wrote its own app. We know hardware doesn't write software. What writes software? Intelligence. Intelligence writes software. Hardware doesn't write it. And yet biologists take their thinking hats off and they claim that life can spontaneously come into existence. The complexity of DNA, unbelievable what's in there. And all of this has basically been found in the last 20, 25 years. Do you know that DNA can be read in both directions? And you can unzip the double helix and produce, you probably have heard the term mRNA, because those vaccines a few years ago were mRNA. So when they unzip it, they produce mRNA that then runs off to produce in the factory to produce proteins. That process can be read in both directions. You try to write meaningful information that can be read in both directions. In a perfect palindrome is like the word race car. The word, you can read it in both directions. Getting longer becomes more of a challenge. Now, I'm going to give you a palindrome which might be risque at first until you know the context. So there's this absolutely most beautiful naked woman being brought to this young man. He's just awoken from sleep, and he goes over to her and he says, "Madam, I'm Adam." You can read it in both directions. Of course, you know that Adam and Eve were naked before the fall, and he wasn't awake when Eve was made from his rib, so he had to introduce himself to her. "Madam, I'm Adam" is a palindrome. This one is more complex. It has to do with Napoleon. He says, "Able was I ere I saw Elba," when he was sent into exile. So try to write meaningful. Do you know that back in the 1970s, between the 25,000 genes, the information in the DNA, they called it junk DNA? No longer. They now know that that epigenetic information is all kinds of error correction routines and reprogramming information. If a woman conceives up on the top of the Andes or on the top of the Himalayas, the developing zygote, the developing fetus, senses atmospheric pressure, and the DNA reprograms. The birth of that child is going to have very large lung capacity. So if you want to train long distance runners, have them born on top of a mountain, and they will naturally have much larger lung capacity. So this is all built into the DNA. Like it's unbelievable what is there. If there's anything said made by God, and we knew nothing about this 25 years ago, all made by God. Take it up a level. How did cells get a nucleus? Not all cells have nucleuses, but how did they get a nucleus? Just ask an evolutionist that. There's theories, but no, they have no concrete evidence. Let's take it up a level. So all of life is supposed to start from a single cell. How did all the different kinds of cells come into existence? But take it even a step further. How did the cells decide to work together? In the human body, we have roughly 250 different types of cells. Most of them come out of different kinds of stem cells, and then they produce different kinds of cells. If you cut your finger, immediately electrical and chemical signals are fired off. And over there, "Hey guys, we need some coagulant over here real quick." And it's sent in and the bleeding stops. Then, okay, now we need some subdermal skin cells. We need some skin cells. Oh, we need hair follicle. And how do cells learn to talk to one another? Think about it. I'm not asking it as a question. It's a rhetorical question. And you take it up a level. The amoebas would clone their chromosomes and then they would split. That's called asexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, you get a set of chromosomes from the mother and a set of chromosomes from the father, and these two work together. And the DNA is programmed to pick the better of the two sequences. If one has a genetic defect in it, the DNA will pick the better of the two from the chromosomes. How did cells decide to work together with two sets of chromosomes? And even if a viable life form was spontaneous to come into existence, it had the female organs at the exact same place and time, one would have had to come into existence with the male organs. Unbelievable difficult challenges here, and yet God has the answer. He made them male and female by their kinds. Right there, we have the answer. Charles Darwin made an astounding statement in his book on the origin of species. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modification, my theory would absolutely break down. Keep that in mind. He admitted that it would absolutely break down. Darwin knew nothing about DNA. When he wrote and published in 1859, the Watson and Crick were doing their analysis of DNA, starting to understand it in the 1950s using X-ray techniques. 100 years later, from when Darwin published, Darwin knew nothing about genetics. Mendel was growing his peas, garden peas, in the garden in his monastery in Germany, and he was tracing how the different genetic traits can go, and he published his paper in 1865, I think it was, but it was certainly after Darwin had published, 5 years after at least, but nobody paid any attention to genetics until 1900. We know now how important genetics are. They use genetics for solving crimes. They use genetics like you can trace in genetic registries, and you can connect up that individual and for crime solutions. We use it for tracing our ancestry. We use it for with genetic diseases and all kinds of stuff, right? Genetics is highly important today. And and then Darwin knew nothing about the complexity of cells. In his day, a cell was just a amorphous mass of protoplasm. It was like jello. That's what it was. Well, we now know that cells are amazingly complex factories. You can go to YouTube and see things like ATP production and the production of proteins, and there's simulated animations. They're mind-boggling what's going on there. And they're working at, if they were scaled up, they're working at speeds that are faster than jet engines. It's unbelievable. This is a flagellum on an E. coli bacterium. And it is like boats would have a propeller and a rudder, but the flagellum acts as both. It spins like a propeller, but it also acts as a rudder. Like, it's absolutely brilliant engineering right here. And those different colored pieces are different proteins. You have to have all of that in place at exactly the same time, or that entity is going absolutely nowhere. If you just made the filament and stuck it on a bacteria, it's not going to be much use, is it? If you have a rotor and no filament, it's not going to be of much use. It's these micro machines in cells that utterly destroys evolution. And so we call Darwin's bluff. These could not have developed through slight incremental changes. Any of you grow tomatoes? Yeah. So what do you need to have a lot of tomatoes? Well, you're looking at a picture, you say you need bees. Well, actually you don't, because the bees that you think of are honeybees, and honeybees were imported from Europe. The bees you need are bumblebees. And bumblebees and tomatoes are native to the Americas, and they are in a symbiotic relationship. Now, why bumblebees? Actually, it's really cool. In Leamington, north of Lake Erie in Ontario, we have now the largest concentration of massive greenhouses in the world. We have fresh tomatoes, fresh cucumbers, lettuce, strawberries, all kinds of stuff coming out of those greenhouses year round. And Heinz has actually moved ketchup production back to Leamington because they can get fresh tomatoes year round. They were out in the U.S. for a while, but they've moved it back to Canada. So you can buy Heinz ketchup now that's made in Canada. And you don't have to just go to French's. But they've moved it back because they can get a guaranteed supply of fresh tomatoes all the time. Now, if you go and look at YouTube on how they do this, there are basically two ways you can pollinate tomatoes. One is in greenhouses, in in your garden, you could probably use a Q-tip or something. But in the greenhouses, they use those extender things. You power them down the aisles, and you can go up and down on these accordions on a platform. I don't even know what they're called. Stairmasters. I don't know what they're called. But what are they? They go up and down. Elevators, What are they called? A lift of some sort, sky lift or something, yeah. So you can go up on these things, and the tomato vines grow way, way up there, and they're up there, and they use an electrostatic wand to vibrate the flowers open, and then the pollen dust goes through. The other way they do it is they bring in bumblebees, and they literally ship a box of bumblebees through Canada Post, as long as Canada Post is working, and you can bring it. Sorry for my political jabs here, but you can bring in these. They open a little trap door, and the bumblebees fly around in the greenhouse. If you want a lot of tomatoes in your garden, you want to have plants that attract bumblebees. Now, why bumblebees? Bumblebees are the only bee while they hum that hum while they work, and they hum at a perfect middle C. And when they hum at the perfect middle C, they're like a tuning fork, and they vibrate the yellow flowers open for pollination. I come back 2 or 3 years from now, you won't even remember who I am. You won't even remember what I presented. I guarantee you'll never forget the bumblebees. So evolutionists cannot explain symbiotic relationships. It's something that God instituted, and they can't explain it. One more example, origin of human languages. Languages are incredibly complex, and evolutionists will tell you that they developed through out of the African savanna, through grunts and groans and different warning calls and so on. But the interesting thing is that older languages are more complex than newer languages. If I go up the French side of English, French is a more complex language than English. Latin is more complex. Greek is more complex. And Sanskrit is the oldest, and it's even more complex. Languages are decaying through time. They're not evolving. They're devolving. Not information is not being added, it's being taken away. There's been a common vocabulary decline. It's estimated at the time of William Shakespeare, the average native English speaker could use about 60,000 words. It's estimated now that the average native English speaker can use roughly 15,000, and the average teenager only about 100. And they used to try to find the original proto-language. They've given up on that. They now talk about the bushes of languages, because there are very, very distinct families of languages. Interesting enough, around 2200 BC, a whole bunch of languages appear in history, and they have written forms: hieroglyphics, ideographic, cuneiform, alphabetic, and so on. All kinds of things. Well, we know the answer at the Tower of Babel. Again, Genesis 1 to 11 is significant in dealing with this. And so human languages confirm the biblical account. They are devolving, not evolving. Just a few pieces of evidence that the earth is not billions of years old. I mentioned that we have nuclear DNA, the double helix. You've probably seen the pictures somewhere on that. We also, in some of our cells, have another chunk of DNA, and this is in what is called the mitochondria. And they are the central processing units for the manufacturing in the cells. And they generate the electricity from the food that we eat, and they run the factories and direct all that's going on inside of the cell. Inside of the mitochondria, there is a ring of DNA, and not a double helix, it's a ring, and it has 16,600 nucleotides versus the 3 billion, and there are 37 genes versus the 25,000 genes. But we only inherit our mitochondria DNA from our mothers. We don't get any mitochondria DNA from our fathers. when geneticists look at this, do you know that there are three basic strands of mitochondria DNA across the whole human population? Do you know why? Three basic strands. They come from the wives of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, you can't map which wife because you have no clue, but they come from those three women. Geneticists can overlay those three basic sets, eliminate the mutations that have occurred. They can actually determine the original three sets of mitochondria DNA, and then they can go back to the original set that Eve had. We can actually define what Eve's original mitochondria DNA looked like. And in fact, they call it in the science literature mitochondria Eve. That's what they call it. Of course, they don't believe in biblical Eve. Now, we all have basically identical mitochondria DNA because we inherited it all from Eve. But there have been some mutations through the ages. There were some between Eve and the flood, and there have been some since then. Are phenotypic variations. Are we okay? Somebody fall asleep or is it sick? Okay. Our phenotypic differences, like our hair color and skin color and shape of our eyes and all those kinds of things, that comes from our nuclear DNA in our nucleus, not from our mitochondria DNA. And studies were done to look at seeing how many mutations occur in the mitochondria DNA through time. And I'll give you an example of a scenario. It is the case study, but I'm just inventing the scenario. If you would picture that in a museum in St. Petersburg, there's the hairbrush of Princess Katerina, and we can get a piece of hair that has the follicle on it, and we can do the mitochondria DNA, 16,600. You can sequence that in a few seconds with modern technology. And we know who her great-great-great-great-grandchildren are. We can pull the hair, and we can compare the DNA, and we can see how many mutations. So Ann Gibbons' writing says they were stunned to find how rapid the mutations were occurring because they were assuming Homo sapiens had been on the earth for 300,000 years. And she says that the mitochondria rate is too rapid to support evolution, and a measured rate indicates that mankind has been on the earth for only 6,000 years, which I said at the beginning. But then she goes on and says, nobody believes that. And a second example why the earth can't be billions of years old is the human genome is decaying rapidly. John Sanford has written a book called Genetic Entropy, and mutations are occurring at the rate of roughly 200 additional mutations in every generation. So sitting on your lap there, you have a mutant. So every generation is adding roughly 200 mutations, and John Sanford predicts that in roughly 300 generations, the human population will go extinct. Now, we're roughly 200 generations from Adam. We know that genetic diseases are increasing continually, and we're seeing the decay in the genome. I suspect if I ask you, how many of you know somebody who's had cancer? Almost everybody these days will. And it's getting worse and worse and worse. Now, we don't have to worry about it because we have the promise in Genesis 9 that God is never again going to destroy the human race, and Jesus is going to solve this problem when he recreates the universe. So I won't make any time predictions, but we don't have to worry about it. Mary Schweitzer, writing in the Smithsonian, found soft tissue in dino bones, and evolutionists said, well, that's impossible. You can't have organic material that lasts 65 million years. But she has gone on and written on this, and other scientists as well. In fact, in our database, we have about 130 different papers on different dinos and other fossils that still have soft tissue in them. And we have, that. But here's an example in Saskatchewan a couple years ago. A T-Rex was dug up there, and it had soft tissue. Notice what the BBC reported. For centuries, it's been thought that there's effectively no trace of biological tissue in a fossil, and there shouldn't be. That was what they believed. It turns out the fossilization process isn't quite as straightforward or maybe not as rapid as we thought it would be. This is pure waffle. They do not know how organic material can last 65 million years. Whereas if it was buried in the flood, we're talking 4,400 years, a lot more probable. And so, one more example, the Earth is a big giant magnet, and we have a magnetosphere that protects us from cosmic rays, and animals use the magnetic field to navigate. When pottery was cast about 1000 AD, and there's iron in clay, you could actually measure the magnetism when it's fired. You go to the same clay bed today, use the same firing techniques, and then measure the magnetism. The magnetic forces decline by 40% in 1,000 years. If that extrapolates out in about 1,000 years, the Earth will no longer have a magnetic field. People wouldn't be able to go outside because they'd fry from the cosmic rays, and birds and sea turtles and so on would no longer be able to navigate. Well, again, we don't have to worry about that because Jesus is going to deal with it. But notice that it indicates that the world is rapidly decaying. And scientists admit this. Our planet's protective shell isn't quite what it used to be. Over the past 2 centuries, its magnetic strength has taken a nosedive. And nobody has the foggiest idea why. Well, that isn't true. I know why. The Earth is old, and it's decaying rapidly. And Paul says the whole creation's groaning, waiting for its redemption. And so there isn't time for this supposed evolution. Just a real quick on facts to support the biblical flood. Mass burial grounds and extinctions and jumbles of dinos and birds and even sea creatures. You try to find any meteorological, climatological, geological process today. Try to identify anything that can make these kinds of mass burial grounds. Sediment layers that are worldwide. Do you know there's a sediment layer that goes from the middle of Manitoba right across to the Rockies and down into the United States? How on earth was that formed using anything like a local flood or its river delta? It was from the Genesis flood. The Grand Canyon was not formed by the Colorado River. The soft sediment had been laid down during the flood, and then as the new forming ocean basins are taking to take all that water that had come from the underground aquifers when the fountains of the deep burst open, it had to be funneled into the oceans. That massive runoff through soft sediment formed the canyon, and then the Colorado River follows it. And Mount St. Helens gives an illustration of this because when the volcano exploded and all that steam came up, turned into rain, came down, and then also the ice cap melted, all this slush and water came roaring down, and it laid down sediment within hours that within 5 years was hardening into rock. And so we can see that. And when you look at the fossil records, you find examples of ripple marks, footprints, and the impressions of leaves and so on. That can only happen if the sediment layers are being laid down rapidly and gently to preserve that. And the flood is the best explanation. Animals captured in death throes instantly. And again, you have to lay down the sediment rapidly. In the canyons, the sediment layers are razor thin, no evidence of erosion, no evidence of soil formation. Only again, not millions of years apart, laid down during the flood. Tree trunks that run up through multiple layers of shale, sandstone, and coal, and clay, and all the way up. Those tree trunks would have eroded away millions of years ago if that was the case. Instead, they're through all these layers because they were laid down quickly. You cannot take rock and twist it and bend it like this. It had to have been plastic sediment that was sandwiched during the new continent formations and then hardened into rock thereafter. Other forms can only be explained with the flood. So there is, and I in all these presentations I can go into a lot more detail. This is an overview, but there is overwhelming scientific support for biblical creation in the Genesis account. But the problem is that Peter challenges us to be able to make a defense, and we need to be able to make a defense. And you've been drinking from a fire hose here, the amount of information I have been putting out. So you'll just have this vague idea. But we need to get this information so that we can be prepared. So one thing you can do is sign up for Creation Magazine. Under the table there, Rob, there's clipboards. Can we pass them around? Oh, they look like this. First clipboard, first one should look like this. The other one we'll do in a second. So just pass the ones. If you want to join up, on every Friday we send out a email, and alternate Fridays international mailing, and then on the alternate Fridays it's the Canadian mailing, and we send this out, and we will keep you up to date on all of our latest books, our latest articles, speaking tours, and so on, videos. And we have a book here called Christianity for Skeptics. And it's a tremendously good resource to explain to people who say, well, what's the difference between Islam or Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity? And also, our most relevant book all the time is our Creation Answers book. And we have those you can get in a pack, which makes it cheaper. And sadly, I don't have any of these left. We've sold out internationally on these, and we're waiting for the newest edition to come in. But it's written by our scientists challenging evolution. I do have the DVD here, though, and the Genesis account, which is a combination of science and theology. And I sold out the last library pack last night, but you can order this on our website. It is a tremendous amount of good material. Creation Magazine. Now we can ship around the other clipboards. Just pass them around. You tear off the bottom form. If you want to subscribe to our magazine, it is a family-oriented magazine. We do have a technical journal as well, but this is family-oriented. It is the longest-running publication in the creation space. We have been publishing it for over 45 years. CMI has been in existence for about 50 years, and you can sign up for it. We bill $9.50 a quarter. We mail a paper copy, but we also you can have the PDF version, and you can distribute the PDF version. The only reason we charge for our materials is because it costs us money to manufacture them. We try to get this stuff out as cheaply as possible. The pricing on this is as low as we can possibly make it. We make no money selling that material. We also don't charge churches when we come to them. The only way we can fund CMI is by donations and people who care enough to see the message getting out. So we don't charge churches when we go. I'm going to a church tonight that only has 15 people in it. Can you imagine if they had to pay to fly me out and all the material? So we don't charge, but God's providence, we've been well taken care of in terms of getting this material. If you subscribe to Creation Magazine today, you can take a free copy of the magazine right now and a DVD, and you don't pay anything. You only pay when we mail it out quarterly. Here are some examples of articles from the magazine. So tear off the bottom form and fill in both sides. And we have a children's pack for kids that can read, but younger. Parents, of course, could read it too. And we have a series that's oriented to little kids, which would require a parent or grandparent reading to them. Creation's Answers book, I have those here with me for kids, but you don't have to spend any money. We have so many resources out there on creation.com, and you can just go. It's got to be the easiest website to remember, right? Creation.com. And we are on all kinds of channels, YouTube and so on. And don't forget then to connect with us with one of signing up for our emailings in Creation Magazine. So in the church today, whether it's in congregations or right up to the academic communities, there's been this undermining of belief in Genesis 1 to 11 and turning it into basically a myth. We need to get our guns aligned. We need everybody from kindergarten right up to the most brilliant PhD person to all be challenging evolution, because to be blunt, it is a pernicious evil. So we'll end there. I'm not sure, were we going to allow some questions now, or